Great. Let's start then. So yeah, thanks for inviting me. I'm John Kilmister, and during the day, I'm a principal software architect working in Azure. You can find me on Twitter at John Kilmister, and I also blog at blueboxes.co.uk. So today, we're going to have a look at building Azure static web apps over the next 15 minutes or so. And this is a brand new feature that is available inside Azure. The topics we're going to cover very briefly are, well, what is a static app? Before we can talk about Azure static apps, we have to understand what a static app actually is. And then we'll have a look at the features of Azure static web apps. We'll also then actually see how to go and create one of those in the Azure portal and look at prices and next steps, further information. And if all goes to plan, that will be in 15 minutes. So let's start with what is a static web app? Well, the term static app can be totally overloaded. People use it in lots of different terms. You could think back to the 1990s websites where you literally just had a HTML page. That's static, it doesn't move. But these days, people think a lot more about static apps, including JavaScript, being fully interactive, having API calls and grabbing extra data. And you might hear that description and think, that's not static. Well, let's have a look at why we refer to that as a static web app. Web application models. So kind of a traditional model is something like ASP.NET or maybe a bit more recently, something like Node.js or PHP. And in those, the majority of the work is done at runtime on the server. Alternatively, you can have a front-end framework like React or Angular or Vue. The web browser loads the library, and then at that point, all of the work is done. It's pulling in additional APIs and various other bits and pieces. And these on the right are what we refer to as static, because the files sitting on the server don't change. Where in an ASP.NET application, the server's doing all the work, things are dynamically being generated. Let's have a look at this in a slightly different way. So our traditional app, at build time, we do our compile traditionally. We then, as a user, will go and grab that. And on the web server, we're getting APIs, we're hitting databases, we're doing all of that. Comes back to the client, and we just top it up with a little bit of JavaScript for a bit of interactivity. If we compare that to the first type of static app, so a single page application, Angular, Vue, React, build time is a transpilation. Then when the client browser requests it, what they're actually requesting is just a load of static JavaScript files. That goes back to the client, and we're left in most cases with a blank page because we don't have any real data. We've got the framework, we've got the logic, we've got a blank page. So we need to make some further APIs, and then on the web server, we're going to go off to our databases and grab the bits and pieces. Now, it's been acknowledged that more recently that's a problem from an SEO perspective, also from a usability perspective on slow devices and various other things. So one option is to build what we call a static site, or use a static site generator to build everything up front. So at build time, we're running a load of JavaScript code, and we're going and getting additional data from APIs, from third-party databases and various other bits and pieces. But on the web server, most importantly, it's still just JavaScript, HTML, CSS, images, static content that doesn't change. And the user comes along and they request their page, it gets served up, it's super fast because all the content's there. You can use further APIs if you need to, but it's try and get as much upfront data. So both our JavaScript framework / Spa app and our site that's been generated ahead of time are both what we refer to as static. So I kind of summarize this, or at least my quote would be that a static website is one where the HTML is not generated on the server at runtime. And that then really separates out the fact that you can make additional API calls, the fact that your website might be dynamic and running JavaScript in the browser. The key thing is it's the HTML that sits on that server that isn't generated at runtime. And if you're looking for another word for this, people call it the jam stack. You might think, why jam? Well, it's just JavaScript, APIs, and markup. And that's kind of it. There's no other parts to it. So we've looked here at static apps just more generally, but what's the addition to Azure that we've recently seen that now supports these as a first-class citizen? Well, Azure Static Web Apps are fully featured serverless hosting platform, but it also adds in support for those APIs should you need to make those callbacks. And that's all wrapped up in a nice package. And we can see this quite easily by an image that's presented on the official documentation. You commit your code to source control, GitHub or DevOps, then using CI/CD, that then gets transpiled and the various other processes that go on, and it gets published to the Azure Static Web Apps. That publishes both the static content that we've talked about quite a bit, but also any supporting APIs. So that's the general concept. We're going to dive a little bit deeper in now and look at the features of an Azure Static Web App. So as I mentioned, you do CI/CD, and that is built in from the ground up. So if you go with GitHub, there are GitHub actions that will automatically be generated for you. So next to no effort there. And with DevOps, we have some tasks that you can use. Each branch you create will automatically give you a staging environment and deploy your code to that staging environment. Global hosting. So unlike other options in Azure, you don't have to put in a CDN on top of it. It comes out of the box. We get SSL and domains, with all websites pretty much now needing an SSL. They've been a hassle to set up in the past. Well, every domain that you add will automatically give you a free auto-renewed SSL cert. You can actually set multiple domains and Apex domains, and you can select one of those to be your default, and all traffic will get rerouted to it. The next thing, security. So security can be hard in a single page application or that's running exclusively in the browser, and you need something on the server to help you out. Well, Azure Static Web Apps give you AD authentication or GitHub or Twitter auth, and you can actually specify that down to an individual URL. Local environment, so when you're running it locally, you actually supports authentication emulation. So you can pretend to be someone logged in as Twitter or GitHub or whatever. If you want to host this internally for an intranet site, for example, you can now lock it down by private endpoints, or you can restrict by IP address. Configuring and routing. One of the things that JavaScript struggles to do is 301 and 302 redirects. Those can only be issued by a server. So hosting this in Azure Static Web Apps, even though it's not a full-blown web server, it's completely serverless, it still allows you to issue out 301 and 302 redirects. You can also add in custom HTTP headers. Again, something you couldn't necessarily do with a static web app just stored in, say, blob storage. And finally, we've got Azure Functions. So when you do need to make those callbacks, be it from your single page app or from your static site generator app, you've got Azure Functions that get deployed alongside it. But the important thing about the Azure Functions here that are deployed, they're hosted on the same domain as your website. So it gets rid of the problems around CORS or authentication and some of the other considerations that you would have had with Azure Functions just sat somewhere else in the portal. The functions also, they can be deployed as part of this, but equally you can actually hook up existing functions that you have. So that's a very quick look at all of the different features that are available. But how does this compare? So I've been using these kind of static sites or single page apps in Azure for some time, and I've been putting them in blob storage. You enable website hosting inside blob storage, and it will serve your page up. We also have Azure Web Apps on an app service. They're quite heavyweight. They're still PaaS, but they're quite heavyweight. But they do server-side language support. And then we've got our static web apps that we're just talking about. So if you are looking at doing sort of .NET or sort of PHP or Java, you'll still need to use Azure Web Apps. But when it comes to things like authentication, that's now available in your static web app, something that hasn't been available if you were hosting your site in blob storage. Custom domains, again, they were supported by blob storage, but not to the same extent. You actually, if you wanted HTTPS, you had to route it over a CDN, so added extra infrastructure. Staging environments, similar story. You could work around it, but nothing there. CDNs, server-side redirects, SSL certs, and it just continues on. So what they've really done is take the websites that you may have been hosting in blob storage and added in many of the modern features that are needed to run a website, the redirects, the HTTP headers, all of those things. And it means that you no longer have to use an Azure web app or add additional services on top, such as CDNs or front door or other routing. And it integrates Azure Functions, which is a big plus, as I said, because it's on the same domain. So now we look at the features. Let's see how we go about actually creating these. In the interests of time, I'm not going to do a live demo, so I'll just take you through the basic screens that you see in the Azure portal. But it's also worth noting that you can deploy these through Terraform or ARM. There's also a command line interface that you can download that's currently in preview, and you can use Visual Studio Code as well to manage these. For this example, we're just going to use a React app, but you could equally use a Blazor app or a Angular app or any of the frameworks that are supported. All I've done is a React Create app, nothing special there, it's just loaded in Visual Studio Code. I've uploaded that to GitHub. Note that it's a private repo, so all of this will work both on public and private repos. Again, not done anything special, just push the code just straight up there and you can see the default getting started with React app. So now we'll switch over into the portal, and if you start searching static web apps, you get to see the option you need. It lists out all the static web apps that you have, and then you can click the create button. And we'll quickly go through some of the key options you need to fill in when using the portal. So obviously you need your subscription and resource group, fine. The name no longer needs to be globally unique. If you've done things like blob storage or some of the other Azure resources, it needs to be globally unique. In this case, it doesn't. When it comes to a host name later, it will randomly generate one for you. There are two plans, free and standard. We'll have a look at that right at the end. But free for personal projects is very generous and will get you most of the way there. The Azure functions, unlike the actual static files, which are behind the CDN, the Azure functions do need to be in a location, and you can select all the regions that normal Azure functions can live in. If we scroll down, this is where it starts to get a bit more interesting and starts actually hooking into our code automatically. So if you're in GitHub, you do get a slightly nicer experience. If you're not, you just select other and you have to do all your CI/CD yourself. But in GitHub, you authenticate and just select your repository and your branch. After this, you get the option to select one of many presets from the list. And as you can see there, we have both the frameworks, you'll see Blazor, Vue, React, and also the static site generators that I referred to. And by selecting one of these, it's going to create a set of GitHub actions automatically for you. So I did that. And as you can see there, we've got a URL that says yellow mushroom, it's just randomly generated. And we get all our configuration options down the side. If we instantly navigate to yellow mushroom, then you can see that it's waiting for your content. But a quick refresh a minute later, and you have your app. So how did that all happen automatically? Well, behind the scenes, when you authenticated with GitHub, it added in a GitHub action. And we can see here there's the Azure Static Web App workflow file. Took 2 minutes to run. So after 2 minutes, you'll automatically get a site. It also puts a secret in your action secrets, and that's how it's going to authenticate through and actually deploy your app. So we want to go and make a change to this app. So we make a slight typo, so we went in, made a change. As soon as you create a pull request, and this is pull request 3, you can see there, as you'd expect, the GitHub actions automatically kick off and it started another build. We can jump across to there and you can see that nicely. Update app.js, and it's building. If we jump across now back into the portal, and on the left-hand side go down to environments, we can actually see we've got a production environment and staging environments, and you can have up to 10 staging environments at any one time. And against the staging environment, you see a browse button. And what this allows you to do, for every pull request, you can actually get a separate version of the website. You can see here that the text I changed was hello team to hello everyone. And the URL has changed subtly as well. We're now on the same URL, but -3. And -3 is the ID of that pull request. Once you merge that pull request in, that staging environment disappears. So now we have pull requests that we can go and browse to, and people can look over the actual changes. So I want to finish up just by talking about pricing, because this all sounds really good. We get loads of features for our Azure Static Web App. And if we think about things like app service plans, you're paying in the UK about £20–30 for the cheapest non-shared tier. So how does it compare to that? Is this going to set me back? Is it going to be a problem? Well, the good news is that actually there are two tiers. There's a free tier, which is really generous, and also a standard tier. But even on a standard tier, you're only paying £6.07 a month. Now, these prices are for the UK in July of 21. So as always, do check the prices out on the official site. But we can see here, though, on the free one, you get 100 gig per subscription. You can put 2 domains on there. You still get your free SSLs. You can still do authentication, and you can still do Azure functions. You can't bring your own Azure functions, so you can't have them elsewhere in the portal and bring them in. If you want to do that, you do need to go up to standard. And there are a few other options on standard as well. Obviously, the Azure functions you'll be billed for separately. But yeah, the free tier is very generous, and will say for hobbies and personal projects, proof of concepts is good. And the standard tier, which gives you SLAs and all the things you'd need in a corporate environment, isn't that expensive at only £6 a month at the moment. So hopefully you liked what I had to say and thought that was interesting. But where should you go next? We've only had 15 minutes or so. Well, there's a number of resources. So, and I'll paste these in the chat in a minute. The Microsoft Learn portal now has a dedicated path for Azure Static Web Apps that will take you through the different features. A couple of weeks ago, there was an Azure Friday video that took you through the command line tool that you can download that's currently in preview. And that showed you things like local authentication, emulation, and various other bits and pieces. You can follow Azure Static Web Apps on Twitter, and they do post updates and various bits and pieces. And finally, if you're interested more generally about sort of static apps, and you want to know what frameworks you should look at, if you're interested in static site builders, but don't know which one would suit you, jamstack.org is a really good resource. And that brings me to the end. So as I said, you can find me on Twitter at John Kilmister, where I tweet about Azure and various other bits and pieces, and my blog's at blueboxes.co.uk.